So welcome, and our topic is overcoming spiritual discouragement. And I'm just happy that we can meet this way digitally, when because of the circumstances of the moment we were unable to meet in person as we'd hoped. Now, I've begun with this image here of Our Lady of Consolation, honored in the sanctuary up in Turin in northern Italy. That's the shrine of the Consolata, Our Lady of Consolation, and there you see the interior of it. It's a really beautiful, ornate church, and you can see in the upper part of the photo where the original image is kept. And the reason I've begun with this image is because Venerable Bruno Lanteri, whose teaching we're going to be looking at, lived in this city close by, would have celebrated Mass many times in that shrine, prayed very often before this image of Our Lady. So we'll begin in a Marian space, which is very deep in his heart. And let's place in her heart what we do here together as we go through these videos and go through this teaching together. So we're going to look at the teaching of the Venerable Bruno Lanteri, and I have entitled this Overcoming Spiritual Discouragement, and advisedly have made the word overcoming bigger than the rest of it. Now, the title I'm going to give, in his life he would have been known as Father Bruno Lanteri. I'm going to refer to him as Venerable Bruno. And there's a technical sense to that term. What that indicates is that his cause of canonization has been introduced. It was introduced in 1930. And in 1965, St. Paul VI formally declared him venerable, which means the Church has examined his writings and his life and declares that this is a man who lived not only sanctity, but heroic sanctity. For his beatification, a miracle is needed, and a second for his canonization. So this is a man whose cause of canonization is well advanced at this time. So that's the title, Venerable Bruno, is how we'll speak of him. This is the cover of the recent book that I've done, on which what I'll be sharing now is based. Series of quotations from his writings of spiritual direction on this theme of overcoming spiritual discouragement. The reason I put this here is that when you write a book, you're so involved in crafting the book and shaping the material and trying to get your sentences right and grammar and vocabulary and so forth, that you can't quite read it the way a reader reads it. And I was asked to speak on this topic several months ago, and for the first time, it may sound odd, but I read my own book the way a reader might read it, and was just deeply stirred by the teaching of this man, Venerable Bruno, about this theme of overcoming spiritual discouragement. And I realized something that I hadn't even seen in the writing of the book, and that is that the space that Venerable Bruno addresses and that we're going to be looking at is that deep space in the heart, I believe, of every one of us. I may say this reverently, but I believe this is true, that is afraid. Now, when you and I meet each other, we say, hi, how are you? We smile, say, fine, how are things with you? Great. And that's very appropriate. These are the social proprieties. But in settings where we feel free to say what is deeply there in our hearts, I believe that in all of us there is a place that is afraid, whatever the nuances are. Lord, you would want me to be here, but I'm here. I don't use my time well. I miss opportunities to help other people. My prayer is spotty. It's so poor sometimes. I finish my prayer and hardly even know what I've said to the Lord. I'm more self-indulgent than I ought to be, and on the list can go. There's a place in us that doesn't stop us from living our lives, but there's a grayness on the margin, something that weighs on our relationship with God and in the way we interact with others and live our vocations. There's that space that is, at least gently and maybe not so gently at times, discouraged. That's the space that Venerable Bruno is addressing, and addresses that very deep space in all of us with a great sensitivity, with a great reverence, with a great understanding, and with an ability to enter there in such a way that people, they knew that it was safe. This is something else I saw in rereading the book. The reason why people shared this space with him was because they knew it was safe. They knew it would be reverenced, understood, and they would be helped to move beyond it, because God didn't call us to live in discouragement. Jesus came to set captives free, as we read in Luke 4 and throughout the whole work of the redemption. Now this is my image. Here is, let's say, a young girl, elementary school age, and let's say that she's acted out at school in some, for her age, fairly serious way. It's not just a small thing. And word has gotten back to her father. She has just been dropped off at home. She walks up the walk toward the front door and she stands there hesitating. She knows her father is inside and she's afraid. She opens the door and there's her father. And her father doesn't say a word. He just approaches her, holds out his arms, hugs her tightly and says, "I love you." Now she can tell him everything. That's an image of the way Jesus touches that sensitive place in our hearts, and it's really, I think, an image of everything that we'll see Venerable Bruno do as he interacts with people. Now, the way that I want to approach this is through looking at some letters of spiritual direction. Much spiritual direction in his time was done by letter because travel was so much more difficult than today. So if a person has a spiritual director today, it's easy enough to get in the car, take transportation, and 30 minutes later you're there. But a lot of spiritual direction at the time, unless people lived in close proximity, had to be done by letter. And after the death of Venerable Bruno, when the community, the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, the community he founded, began gathering material to write his biography, and with a view toward a process of canonization, they wrote to people who had been spiritually directed by him and asked if they'd be willing to send in these letters or copies of them. And so we have a number of these in the archives. And we're going to look at two letters to this woman, laywoman, married woman, Gabriela Solaro de la Margarita. After Venerable Bruno died, when they asked for letters of this kind, her daughter-in-law went through her papers and found 3 of these letters of spiritual direction which she had conserved, and that's what we'll be looking at. All right, just a little bit about who Gabriela is. She had a first marriage. I don't know exactly the year. My guess would be that probably around the age of 20, young. She had a first marriage, and this was the first tragedy in her life, that her husband died fairly soon after their marriage, and they had no children from it. She remarried, and this was her lifelong marriage to this man, Clemente. Their son, Gabriela, and her husband Clemente had 6 children. One of them, their third, named after their father Clemente, became famous. And their son Clemente's great-nephew wrote a biography of his great-uncle. And in the course of it, described both Gabriela and her husband Clemente. So that's where the details I'm going to share now come from. Clemente was certainly a faithful husband. He was emotionally somewhat closed, a poor administrator, often absent from the family, sometimes for months. And his great passion, the sport that he loved, was hunting. Emotionally variable, up, down, in and out, prone to spend more than the family could afford. A pleasant companion, people just enjoyed being with him and spending time with him. And more than he should have, avoided responsibilities and basically left these to Gabriela. So what you have is, let's say, a faithful husband, but obviously one who has his limitations. Gabriela and Clemente had 6 children. The first 2 boys both died in early age. Infant mortality, as you probably know, was high at the time. Think, for example, of St. Therese of the Child Jesus. 9 children, 4 of whom died in very early age. The first 2 boys. So I would say this would be the next tragedy or tragedies that Gabriela experiences in her life. Clemente, the third son, is the son who became famous. He was for 10 years what was called the Minister of Foreign Affairs in their little country, which is the corner of northwestern, today, of northwestern Italy. And the equivalent of our Secretary of State, or whatever the various nations call him. This is Italy at the time. It was not a unified country yet. It was a hodgepodge of little kingdoms and duchies and republics. And the events that we're looking at, Venerable Bruno lives in this little kingdom of Piedmont, which is this northwestern corner of Italy linked to the island of Sardinia. And everything that we're describing takes place in this little kingdom nestled right up against the much larger and more powerful kingdom of France. And Clemente was for 10 years the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Piedmont. He wrote a book about it in translation, Historical Political Memorandum. I've highlighted his name here, which is well known in the history of the unification of Italy. He was also an outstanding politician in this sense, that in a time in which, much like our own, it took a lot of courage to be openly Catholic in the political arena, he was such, and as such was vilified by those who were hostile to the church and honored by those who were faithful to it. But he was very forthright about this, which is one of the many signs of the fact that very likely not only his mother, but also Clemente himself was spiritually directed by Venerable Bruno, as his great nephew testified in the cause for canonization. As I'm saying, very likely Venerable Bruno was also the director of the Sun. Faithful Catholic, as I've said. The next two were twins, Giuseppina and Gabriella. Giuseppina became a religious, a sister, and Gabriella married. And then the youngest, Enrico, also died young. We have a very moving letter in which Venerable Bruno consoles his mother about that. Now, Gabriella herself, just to get a feel for the times in which she lived, which were not easy times at all. So she lives to be 71. You can see she lives in the latter part of the 18th century as we're moving through the Enlightenment toward the French Revolution, and then the first half, a little less than the first half of the 19th century. When Gabriella is 18 years old, the French Revolution explodes in nearby France, which, as I say, is a powerful country. And this little country of Piedmont is obviously going to be helpless in its wake. And in fact, 7 years later, when she is now 25, Napoleon leads the French armies across the border and in a matter of days defeats the Kingdom of Piedmont, and it is annexed to France. This is the beginning of Napoleon's ascent to the international stage. And from that time, for almost just a little less than the 20 years to follow, this little kingdom of Piedmont will be a nation that has lost its independence. It's overrun by France, annexed to the empire, and everything that is part of the French Revolution floods now into Piedmont with its persecution of the church, the closing of seminaries, the eviction of religious from their convents and monasteries, the heavy hand of Napoleon pressuring the church. This is the time, too, when Napoleon takes the Holy Father prisoner for 5 years until his fall. She lives through all of these circumstances, and this little country is right at the heart of all of this movement. Finally, in 1814, Napoleon is defeated. She is now 43 years old, and she will live the last close to 30 years of her life in the uneasy peace of the Restoration, in which the seeds sown in the Enlightenment and the Revolution are coming to fruition in increasing hostility to the Church, which will actually, not long after her death, flare up into open persecution of the Church. So this is a woman who did not live in very easy times. And in a way that I could have never foreseen when I first began writing about this years ago, all of this is in a time that is bearing more and more resemblance to our own. In a sense, Venerable Bruno's counsel to her gets more and more contemporary as events unfold. Gabriella herself, as described by her son Clemente's great nephew, a woman of interior strength with something virile about her. So this was a strong woman, a capable woman. She could lead and make decisions and move forward forcefully. High-minded, energetic, sure of herself, accustomed to lead and to make decisions. Of a meditative nature, strong in character, with a particular modesty, a good heart under a cold exterior. She was not easily able to show emotion. Constant of will, she could set her goal on something and she would pursue it. And inclined to the good. This was a woman who wanted to live her faith well, who wanted to be a faithful, and more than that, more than a faithful Catholic. The relationship to spiritual direction indicates her desire to live her faith in a very deep and personal way. But a little impatient, as can be the case with capable people, almost sharp, firm and sincere in her judgments, but often too exclusive and narrow in them. She would see a certain thing and it would be very hard to get her to see another perspective on it. Severe in her behavior and tastes, yet with a great pride in her parentage and social position, hardly balanced by a Christian sense of humility. I was presenting this to a group not so long ago, and when we had the sharing session, one woman spoke up and said, we often read letters of spiritual direction between saints. So for example, Francis de Sales to Saint Jean de Chantal. But she said, this is like us, this is people like us. They're good people, faithful Catholics, want to live a good life, but they have their limitations and their failures. She said, it's on our level, and there's something very real about all of that, as we'll see as we go through this. So let's begin to look at these letters of spiritual direction, which you have on the handout. So he writes to her in this particular letter, "My lady and daughter in Jesus Christ, your letter just arrived, and I was glad to receive it, and it gave me real joy." Now you'll notice that Venerable Bruno, and if you go through his letters, you'll see this is a constant. He always leads with the heart. So the first thing that he wants to say to her, I just received your letter with its news of you and your family, and I was happy to receive it, and you see very quickly with Venerable Bruno that when he's working with people, it's not simply fulfilling a function. You came to me for a service, I'll try to do it properly. But his heart is right there. It's actually where everything begins, and everything is shot through with this. And people would have felt this when they would have met with him, that this was a man who is not just trying to help me, but his heart is in this. Your letter just arrived. I was glad to receive it, and it gave me real joy. I am happy to hear that your trip went well, and that your whole family is in good health. Now, if you stop the letter right there, this could be a letter from any family member to a family member, couldn't it? Which is another thing that is always evident in Venerable Bruno. He never bypasses the human. He'll always start with the human. He'll move to the spiritual, and we'll see fairly quickly, but he'll first always reference the human. And on a heart level, glad to hear that your trip went well, just happy to hear that your whole family is in good health. Response to a question which Gabriella would have asked him, I see no reason why you may not entrust your little Louise. This was not one of her daughters, perhaps someone from the wider family, or someone to whose care she had been given. I see no reason why you may not entrust your little Louise to your dear sister, the Lady Countess Vidua. She could not be in better hands, and the reasons for doing so are many. In my view, you may do this with total peace of heart. Now look at the vocabulary already in this letter. And this again, you'll see this in all of his spiritual direction. Glad, real joy, happy, good health, total peace of heart. It's starting on a very warm and affirmative note. All right, that's the human. Now you'll see fairly quickly he moves to where his heart most deeply is engaged. And it gives me greater happiness still. So if the human, the way things are going humanly gives me happiness, it gives me even greater happiness. Well, what is it that gives him greater happiness? It gives me greater happiness still to know that Father Ferrero is there with you. We don't know who this Father Ferrero was. In all likelihood, this is a priest who has moved now close to the family home, either in a local chapel. Some of these Italian homesteads actually have their own chapels on them. Venerable Bruno himself had a farm outside the city of Turin where he would go when he needed to get away from things or as a place to bring retreatants. And if you go there today, you can still see there's a small chapel there where you could celebrate Mass and have maybe about 15, 20 people could fit in this little chapel. What this means, and what gives Venerable Bruno greater happiness still, is that the Eucharist is now available to Gabriella in a way that hitherto it has not been. It is important then, all right, what's important? To begin immediately. And let's just notice both of these words, because these are key words in the spiritual direction of Venerable Bruno. Begin. If you sense the Lord is calling you to take this step, don't wait. Begin. And begin when? Now. Why wait? If you see it, if you know that's where the Lord is leading, then begin, and begin immediately. It's also instructive that when Venerable Bruno speaks to her about her spiritual life, where does he start? The very first thing is the Eucharist. That's the center of everything. So what is it important to begin, and to begin immediately to do? It is important then to begin immediately to arrange with him for receiving communion, and to do so as often as you can. To us this sounds rather, I'd say something that we can easily nod our heads to. But if you consider that in his time, where you still had this Jansenist-tinged pastoral practice, and communion was often reserved to the Easter duty once a year, if that, this counsel to go to communion as often as she can during the week is remarkable. Basically what he's saying to her is, get as close to the Eucharist as you can. And so I would say to anyone listening, obviously I'm aware of the immediate circumstances, but some of us will be listening to this beyond the immediate circumstances. Do you want to grow in your spiritual life? Do you live with a certain discouragement in your life, and you're looking for the way past it? The very first and most powerful and best thing you can do is to get as close to the Eucharist as you can. Now, we all have limitations in terms of time, responsibilities in the family, studies, work, and all of that needs to be reverenced. But could you get to Mass once during the week? Twice? Some of us, it could be daily. Could you stop in before the Blessed Sacrament and just spend some time of prayer before the Blessed Sacrament outside of Mass? Get as close to the Eucharist as you can. This is the first thing he's saying to this woman. Busy woman raising 4 children in the circumstances that we've described. The closer you get to the Eucharist, the more you will find hope and energy flowing into your life. If from these recorded talks you were to take nothing other than the resolve to get just a little bit closer to the Eucharist in your own life, then you will have already taken the most important thing we can say in this time that we share together. He continues, you must be consistently faithful, and note those words too, fidelity and consistency. You must be consistently faithful to what? To meditation and to spiritual reading, both classic spiritual practices. But I'm a busy married woman. I have 4 children. I have a family to raise. I'm just running all day at work, and when I get home, there are children to deal with. Studies are overwhelming, I can't get them all done, whatever are different. So he's going to answer that tacit objection. Yes, meditation is a wonderful thing, spiritual reading is a wonderful thing, but my life is so hectic and so busy. I'm not a monk in a monastery. I don't have time to do those kinds of things. And he knows he's writing to a woman for whom this is very real, as it is in many of our lives. So, how's he going to deal with that? You must be consistently faithful to meditation, if it be only a quarter of an hour of meditation. I can't go off to church for an hour with all the demands and work and family and financial issues and the rest. Can you get 15 minutes? Well, maybe I could. Probably I could in the course of the day. 15 minutes for meditation. Now that can take whatever form in our rich, multi-dimensional life of prayer we have in our Catholic Church, whatever form best speaks to you. For some of us it may be Lectio Divina, that way of praying with Scripture. For some of us, the Liturgy of the Hours. For some of us, the Rosary. St. John the 23rd prayed the 15 decades every day, became a saint through it. It might be Ignatian reflective meditation or Ignatian imaginative contemplation and so on. There are so many ways of praying in our rich Catholic spiritual tradition. Can you find 15 minutes in the course of a day to spend with the truth of our faith, with the Word of God, to be nourished and fed by that and strengthened? And today, as I've said, we have many more ways of doing this. With all the problems that are there with the digital world today, there are so many benefits in the digital world today. Get the book, hard copy, meditate with it, scripture or another book. Listen to a podcast for 15 minutes. I don't have time to do that. Could you listen to a podcast while you're on the train commuting to work? While you're in the car going to pick up the children after school? While you're commuting in your own car? Could you watch some Catholic television? Listen to or watch a conference on YouTube? Can you find 15 minutes a day? Some of us could find more. Some of us may find 15 minutes hard. Can you find 10 minutes a day? Choose a solid way of meditating. Choose a sustainable amount of time, and then be consistently faithful. This is what he's saying to this woman, and I'd say by extension to all of us. Spiritual reading. And so, again, I'd love to read. I know there are wonderful books, but my life is so hectic, I don't have time to sit down with a book. I remember one woman telling me that the only way she could pray, she had several young children, was to go in the bathroom and lock the door. I don't have time to read. My life is that hectic, is that busy. And so Venerable Bruno again answers this for this woman. Be faithful to meditation and spiritual reading, if it be but a single page of spiritual reading. Would you have time in the course of the day to read one page from a spiritual book? Probably. Yeah, probably I could do that. What would happen if you didn't? If every day you were taking in these few minutes of nourishment. And again, let's amplify that. Read the book. Could you listen to 5 minutes of a Catholic podcast while you're getting supper? Could you watch a few minutes of a Catholic television show that you know is nourishing for you? Remember one man, there was a journey, one show on Monday evening at 7. He watched it every week. Great. Do that week after week after week. Could you listen to a few minutes of a conference by a Catholic speaker off of your tablet or your phone or your computer? Most of us, I think, will say, yeah, probably I can. Probably I can. Do it. Begin, and begin when? Immediately. Don't wait. And then he says, do the same for the examination of conscience. All right, today we speak of this as the examen prayer. What he's inviting her to do is to live the reflective spiritual life. There's a big difference between a spiritual life in which we never stop to review what's happening spiritually, and a spiritual life in which we take, if only a few minutes each day, to review with the Lord the spiritual experience of the day. Okay, if any of us do try to make the examination of conscience or the examen prayer toward the end of the day, very likely what's in our hearts right now is something like this. Yeah, I know that's there. I know the church speaks of this as important. I sort of try to do it, but I know it's a little quicker than it should be, and I don't feel like I do it very well. You know, all of that sort of thing. So here's a busy woman. She's getting children to bed. She's got all kinds of... How can you ask her to pray the examination of conscience? Which he says you can do while you're working. If no other time, when your hands are busy, but your mind is free, could you do that? Remember reading in the life of Saint Marie of the Incarnation as a young girl in France. She's watching her mother in the house working, and she notices her mother's lips are just quietly moving. Can you review your day with the Lord, maybe in the latter part of the day at some point, even while your hands are working? I posted all of this once on Facebook at the start of Lent. The Eucharist as often as you can. 15 minutes of meditative prayer, 10, 20, whatever works with your life. 1 page of spiritual reading. The examen prayer, if nothing else, while you're working. And this was the response. It is doable. You can do it, and it will make an enormous difference. You will find spiritual discouragement waning, and you'll find hope entering your life.